Hello everyone and welcome back to another lesson. Today we will be finishing the rest of the evolution notes starting on slide 37. So I'm going to talk about convergent evolution, divergent evolution, and coevolution. So convergent evolution is when organisms develop independently from a different ancestor but evolve similar adaptations to similar environments. Similarities between organisms that are not closely related occur because of natural selection for similar phenotypes or specific traits that are best suited for that environment. So an example of that is a shark and a dolphin. Notice that they are very similar in their body shape, their fins, even their coloring. They both have certain adaptations for the aquatic environment. However, a shark is a fish and a dolphin is a mammal. So very different in terms of their ancestry, but both have developed interesting adaptations for different environments. That kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier in terms of biogeography. So I talked about how these flightless birds, although they are in very different environments, different continents throughout the world, they have developed similar traits in terms of those very long legs, most likely to outrun predators. Now, so that's convergent evolution. So when two organisms of different ancestry develop and come together to have very similar adaptations and physical characteristics. The other type of evolution is divergent evolution. So this is when closely related species evolve and become more different in terms of phenotype. And I've already talked about this before, adaptive radiation. So this is species that have evolved from a single ancestor. Depending on their type of environment, have different physical traits and characteristics. So I talked about Darwin's finches before, and then I also talked about the marsupials that are found in Australia. They all are marsupials. They had most likely a common ancestor, but as they went into different parts of Australia where there's different types of environments, they adapted to those environments. Natural selection took place or those other forces of evolution, and we get all these different types of looking marsupials and a bunch of completely different species. So that's an extreme case because we have speciation, because we have completely different species. Here with Darwin's finches, we had most likely a common ancestor. These are all still finches, so they're all still the same species, but they have all developed different beaks depending on the type of environment that they're in. So remember, these were found in the Galapagos, which is a chain of islands. So maybe there's an area of the island or an island where there's a lot of leaves, and this bird is adapted to eating those. Maybe there is an island where there is a lot of insects, or an area of the island where there's a lot of insects. We have this bird that is adapted to that. And again, this occurs through natural selection and or any of those other driving forces, but natural selection being the main one, in that certain species are selected by nature in order to survive because they're best equipped for that type of environment. Another example of divergent evolution, I think this was talked about way back in the beginning with that introduction video, and we have this thing called artificial selection. Now, this is when in the video they talked about humans being the one that's making the decisions and essentially is the breeder. This is selective breeding for desirable traits. The best example of this being wolves and dogs. So all dogs are descendant from an ancestor most likely a gray wolf ancestor. And this took thousands and thousands of years for this to happen. Now, humans picked the most tame of the wolves because in order to get to domesticated dogs, they had to pick the wolves that were the friendliest. And over time, we kept breeding those together so that they would be more friendly. And so we as humans can associate ourselves with them. Over time, we get the dog, but then we also get all these different breeds of dogs depending on what characteristic was being bred for. If we wanted something like a corgi, we would select dogs that have a longer body. A bloodhound, we would select dogs that have an extremely good sense of smell in comparison to other dogs. So on and so forth. Dogs have been selected for very specific desirable traits, and we as humans have been the breeder, so to speak. So it's not natural selection taking place because nature isn't the one deciding, somebody else is. And here's just a summary of the differences between convergent and divergent evolution. So for instance, in convergent evolution, two organisms that are very different in terms of their ancestry. So dolphins are mammals, sharks are fish, but they developed very similar adaptations, in this case a tail, because they both live in an aquatic environment. There is another example with foxes. So instead of talking about something like dogs or even these finches, so there is a kit fox and a red fox. They live in different environments and they have adapted to those different environments. And most likely they shared a common ancestor. So again, very similar to what we see with the dogs, the finches, and even those marsupials. We have organisms that have a common ancestor, but then they adapt to different environments and therefore developed different physical traits in response to that. Now, our last type is coevolution. Now, this is really neat because this is a process by which two or more species are evolve in response to changes in the other. So we've talked about symbiotic relationships before. So mutualism, predation, and parasitism are some examples. Mutualism being an example in which both organisms benefit. Predation, there's predator prey. Parasitism, there's the parasite and the host. So I'm going to go over an example of mutualism. So flowers and pollinators. So let's take hummingbirds, for instance. So hummingbirds are pollinators in that they go from flower to flower. They get that pollen on them. They help to pollinate flowers, which helps them to reproduce. However, the hummingbird is specifically looking for the nectar inside of these flowers. So nectar is essentially like sugar water, and that's what these birds want. And specific hummingbirds have adapted to specific flowers. So the flowers have evolved in response to changes in the hummingbird, and the hummingbird has evolved in response to changes in the flower in order to get that nectar. So that's an example of a mutualistic relationship. Let's say for predation. So there's predator-prey relationship. So for instance, if we talk about a hare, so a rabbit, and something like a bobcat. So over time, these two evolve in order to kind of keep up with each other. It's kind of like an arms race. So maybe the rabbit will develop and become more faster in terms of nature selecting for those types of adaptations, and the bobcat maybe will also develop more adaptations to become faster or maybe have better senses. So it's kind of like an arms race between those two organisms if we're talking about predation. Now, the last example in terms of humans, and this is really interesting, is things like bacteria. That's a really good example, or any type of disease that we've kind of combated. So one really good example is MRSA. MRSA is a really nasty infection that people can get, and it is really not a good thing. So many years ago, before doctors knew more about antibiotics and bacteria, so antibiotics are types of drugs that kill bacteria. They don't just kill the bad bacteria, they also kill the good bacteria as well. And a long time ago, doctors were prescribing antibiotics for everything, even something like a viral infection. Now, a viral infection, an antibiotic will not help you because antibiotics kill bacteria. Viruses are a different class of organisms. Viruses and bacteria are two different things. So people were taking these and they were killing all of their bacteria, okay? So again, we have good and bad bacteria in our bodies. So when we take an antibiotic, it's killing the bad, but also killing the good. So we're just going to talk about the bad bacteria for now. So this is what we're using to represent resistance of bacteria. So some of you may have heard of antibiotic resistant. So that means the bacteria won't be killed by those antibiotics. So let's say we have some bacteria in our body and we take an antibiotic for that to kill the bacteria. Well, let's say it doesn't kill all of the bacteria, okay? So now we have bacteria that is resistant to that specific type of antibiotic, and it's just going to multiply. And if we spread that to other people, now other people, if they go to take that drug, it won't work, or that antibiotic. And doctors, since they were over prescribing antibiotics when it was not necessary, this kept happening, and eventually we get something like MRSA, which is a bacterial infection that is resistant to almost every single antibiotic out there. So obviously we have better practices nowadays in terms of prescribing antibiotics, but that is essentially how antibiotic resistance works. And that is our lesson over convergent, divergent, and coevolution.